Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for being with us tonight. And please feel free to begin whenever you want.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. And thank you to all of these wonderful groups that invited me to come and speak today. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm really grateful to everybody who showed up. And like whatever time zone it is that you're in, because right now I'm in Prague, and so it's just after midnight. I've already turned into a pumpkin. That's okay though. I'm super stoked. So like I'm running on adrenaline, a little bit of caffeine, and the excitement of being able to talk to you all tonight. So I'm going to jump right on in. Like I don't want to take up any more time talking about myself than these wonderful people have already done. I just want to share my screen and get right into the presentation. And let's see here. Ta-da! It's actually working. Let's see if we can get that to happen from the beginning. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing. Like, let me see. Yeah, now we're optimized for like computer sound and any video that's actually in the presentation. So see, I faked you out. I faked you all out right off the bat. All right, race, class, and species and animal liberation for the 21st century. I'm doing this presentation. This is like kind of cobbled together from previous presentations and a couple of new bits that I have added in. And I just wanted to like give people an idea about like, you know, why we focus on more than one thing and why total liberation is one of my goals and hopefully one of your goals as well. And to help people to kind of understand why it is important to integrate a race and a class analysis into our like animal advocacy, if you will. So I am going to turn off my video because I'm not quite sure how well my internet is going to hold out tonight, so that you can listen to my dulcet tones and not look at my pretty face until after the presentation is over. So with that, I bid you adieu, and let's jump in. I was working on this presentation, by the way, all the way up until like the very last minute, because like there were so many things that I wanted to add and a couple of things that I felt like were a bit dated. But one of the things that I wanted to add is that somebody had tagged me in a Facebook post earlier. And I really appreciate that person. This is not a dig at them. I hope that they're here. But it was a Facebook post that was a tweet thread that someone had put out on Twitter earlier. And it was like Decolonial Black or Decolonial Spook. And I actually kind of like his Twitter account, but I thought that this was just like this sort of like incomplete take on veganism that I wasn't super crazy about. And I told the person who tagged me, I really appreciated it, but I only agree with like 70% of their analysis. This is like just the first tweet in the thread, by the way. And like the more I actually like went over it, I was like, went down to like 60%, and there was like 45% of their analysis, and you'll see why. So like, let's just break down what he was saying, because I think that it's a really great introduction to why these things are necessary to talk about. His first tweet: funny how white vegans miss how colonized people have been eating meat for thousands of years without health or environmental problems until their ancestors came along. So right off the bat, like, you know, it's framing veganism with like within the terms of whiteness. And we've all heard that before. Like, you know, I see a couple of people here who probably follow the veganarchy. I can usually say it in my head, but coming out of my mouth at like, you know, 10 past midnight, I'm not really good at saying veganarchy, like page on Facebook, where like, you know, people like
movies. I feel like I would.
Oh, sorry. Like there was an unmuted microphone there. Like people like sometimes like, you know, like conflate veganism with whiteness, or use white veganism as a foil, if you will, for like their antagonism toward veganism in general. And this I feel like is bordering on one of those circumstances, because like I have absolutely no idea what people's health was like, you know, like 1,000 years ago. Like people were probably not living very long lives, and like, you know, like, and people were probably not consuming meat to the degree that we do today. And so like, yeah, like, you know, like there's a lot of colonialism that's wrapped up in animal agriculture for certain, for absolute certain. And like, you know, and the environmental problems that we're currently experiencing is one of the symptoms of that. But then he goes on. He's got 4, this is just like one page of his tweets. He's got like 4 tweets on this one. We're just going to go over each one of them. Y'all brought factory farms, destroyed continents worth of land, bred farting ass cows, and forced changes in our diets. It's a you problem. So that's like the first one. That's like the first tweet. I give that one a check. I give that one a check because I like, you know, I agree. Like we'll talk a little bit later on in the presentation about like, you know, when factory farms had actually shown up in our history as a product of the British agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. So totally here for that. By the way, content warning, strong language in this presentation and adult themes. So in case that's not for you, I'm just letting you all know. The second tweet, until y'all get rid of your global colonial capitalist system that put all this food fuckery in place, y'all can buzz off. And I don't like that one. I did not give him a check for that one. I didn't give him a check for that one because irrespective of like, you know, how this global food system got here, the consequences of it is something that all of us have to deal with. All of us have to deal with it, whether or not white people, like, you know, like actually brought this. And yeah, like historically speaking, they totally did. We all kind of have to deal with it. It's like, this is kind of like an abdication of responsibility. Wasn't really crazy about that one. Did not love. 0 stars, 0 stars. Next week, not to mention how direct colonial violence happens on a daily basis, the seas, labor, and land needed to grow your kale, almonds, and avocados. Also, not giving that one a pass. Not giving that one a pass. The kale, almonds, and avocados that we're growing, that's really wild that, like, you know, he's kind of like making this a vegan issue. Like, number one, kale is not a food that's indigenous to like North America. Like, that's not a thing. And he doesn't really quite understand food history, in my opinion, and like, you know, where actual foods came from. It's a very, very Black food, kale. And so like the recent resurgence of its popularity, that is a very white thing. But white people are not the only ones eating it, and vegans are not the only ones eating it. Avocados, like that's another one. And so like people love to create these foils out of certain food products and like, you know, and scapegoat them in many ways. I'm not sure if scapegoat is, maybe we can talk about that in the comments while I'm like, you know, going on my diatribes here. Like, is that a speciesist phrase? I don't know. Like almonds and avocados and kale. And so like, you know, he's just kind of creating like, you know, his own narrative here. About like food that like I suppose exclusively vegans eat. And then he rounds this one out with like, I think we do need to change our food system, but it's a system. We consume what's presented to us and what we have the time and energy to prepare. Mixed. So I gave him a gold star for effort. On that one because yeah, like, you know, we do need to change our food system. It is a food system, and most of us do consume what is like, you know, what's presented to us and what we have time and energy to prepare. I don't think that like, you know, these two things are mutually exclusive, and it is an erasure of vegans of color. So not crazy about it, not loving it, not hating it. It's just kind of in between. Kind of like from Clueless when like, you know what, I'm not overwhelmed, I'm not underwhelmed. Can you just be whelmed? I think that I'm just whelmed with that one. So like, you know, then he rounds out his tweet thread with these three. He says, thinking somehow individual consumption choices can change systems, or even assuming our choices are free ones, is white fantasy thinking. Gave that one a pass. Like Jay Conroy, the cranky vegan, talks about this quite frequently. Like, you know what, like it's not great or like, you know, wonderful, but it's also not terrible that people focus or hyper focus on individual consumption. We actually do have systems in place, and individual choices play a role, but like, you know, that's not like where I feel like the bulk of our work, our greatest work is done. So like, yeah, like he is absolutely right about that. And to reiterate, I'm cool with decent veganism arguments based on health or economics, because we do have room to change 100%. Didn't give up a pass on that one. And I'll get into the reasons for that much later, but the idea that like, you know, that decent veganism arguments based on health or economics should be where he feels most comfortable is actually starting to reveal his, like, you know, his placement in this. Because why is it wrong or bad? Oh my goodness, I actually got that wrong. It's from 10 Things I Hate About You. It's not actually from Clueless. I got my 90s movies mixed up. Thank you for pointing that out. But yeah, like it's pointing to his location here. Like, you know, like veganism arguments based on health, in my opinion, I'm not telling anyone else to think like this, but I think that it's misguided. Why? Because we've seen this all before. Like, there are plenty of donuts and French fries that are vegan. A plant-based diet does not automatically confer health. I think that, like, hoping that it will confer health is in many ways ableist. I also think that it allows people to frame arguments about veganism exclusively in diet instead of in ethics. And most importantly, the idea that only white people would be able to actually give a shit about other animals or experience empathy for other animals is ahistorical. It is not rooted in liberation, and it reveals like an actual bias or discrimination against animals. And last but not least, it feeds into his last point. What I'm not entertaining is moral arguments for veganism from white people who still see BIPOCs, that's Black and Indigenous people of color, as savages. Y'all morally broke as fuck. And I did not give that one a pass. I didn't even give him like partial credit or a gold star for effort. Because like, while it is absolutely true that like, you know, Black people are still experiencing animalization and like objectification and discrimination and disenfranchisement from the system, like based on all of his previous tweets and his complete lack of empathy for other animals, or even a desire to have discussion about like animality and like, you know, and our objectification for other animals within his critique of veganism framed as white veganism. I think it actually says a lot about the person who created this tweet. And it feeds into like, you know, this quote from Mother Angela Davis, who is herself vegan. And many of you probably know her as vegan, but like Angela Davis has been for 40 or more odd years a civil rights activist and prison abolitionist long before we knew her to be vegan. And she actually had this quote to say: straight Black men and white women will always be the weakest links in the struggle for equality because they view equality as achieving status with white men. The problem with that is that white men's status is contingent on the oppression of other people. And that's such a powerful quote. And she did not say that recently. She, like, you know, this was from a while ago. And like, I think that it's a powerful quote because I think that it also reveals, like, you know, our feelings about hierarchy. Like, you know, and she talks specifically about straight Black men and white women because of like their status on the hierarchy as it currently exists. And it reveals that we're actually more interested in like attaining what white men have, and not recognizing that like what white men have is built on the backs of others, and like in explicit terms, built on the backs of animals. Because everything that we understand about human identity is grounded in our understanding of white identity, because white people are who invented identity politics. And that's one of those things that you can read about. There's a book I included in a presentation earlier this week, and it's also in the resources links on my website from George Lipsitz. It's called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness: How White People Benefit from Identity Politics. And so that's one of the things that we see happening. And that's one of the things that we see playing out, because we have created a human identity, and in many ways, the creation of that as a political identity has created animal as a opposite political identity on like, you know, on guard when talking about the spectrum of all of these things together. So like, we're going to go on a little journey tonight or this afternoon, wherever it is that you are located in the world geographically. And we're going to talk about, like, you know, the history of, like, you know, like where we, like how we seem to have gotten here. We're going to go into the 20th century a little bit and talk about the progression of, like, you know, of these politics and how like race and animality relate to one another. And like, you know, we'll talk about our future and where we're going to go, and how, like, you know, the animal rights movement can incorporate a racial analysis, and how we have done it, and how we should probably change our approach to it. So like, when people talk about like where like the origins of animal oppression like have happened, like it's all over the place. Like, people will point to different points in time. Like, I remember, I think circa 2013, reading The Sexual Politics of Meat, and Carol Adams actually talking about this long ago, like, you know, hundreds of years ago, talking about the patriarchal origins of this, and like the domination of animals, and, like, you know, and the patriarchal origins of it. And talking about and in researching, like, you know, the origins of like animal identity and human identity, like, I go back to the Enlightenment. And by the way, I just want to point out, like, you know what, I've actually been, I was invited to watch like the animal rights show, Roger Yates show, and Laura Schleifer has actually been doing some guest appearances on their show. And she's been talking about, like, you know, the origins of the human animal divide as well. And I think that she's got some really interesting thoughts too. Roger Yates has also been doing this for like a grillion years, and he's amazing. But like, I just want to point out that, like, you know, although like different people have different locations for these things, like all of these are like somewhat incomplete theories, and it doesn't mean that anybody is wrong. All of these things complement each other. Like, you know, like revisionist history gets kind of like a bad rap, but I think that it's actually one of those things that's really, really necessary, because it points to like gaps in our knowledge that we can fill in with, like, you know, with different aspects and different perspectives to give us a much more complete picture. Oh, Laura's here. I didn't know, I didn't know that she would be part of this, but like, Laura, hey, how are you doing? Like, definitely check out the Animal Rights Show on YouTube. But yeah, like, I go to the Enlightenment, and I think there's like a wealth of information there. And like, I think that it's really interesting to study Enlightenment era philosophy and philosophers. I don't think that, like, you know, anyone is better than the other. And like many of them, although I respect them sometimes, they are incredibly flawed and their analyses are flawed. And many of them rooted in capitalism, which is one of our favorite things to talk about in animal liberation, or at least one of my favorite things. And one of the philosophers that, like, you know, that I think has a lot of interesting things to say is John Locke. And I do really genuinely mean that. Like, I'm not picking on him, but I think that one of his quotes actually speaks to, like, you know, the topic here about like how we have formed human identity and all of the amazing provocative thinking that was going on at this time and some of the provocative writing. And this quote actually, like, you know, it reveals something about us, because he says, all mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Again, possessions, talking about capitalism there. But like, you know, he's talking about like our natural rights that are conferred to us by natural laws, and natural laws are, of course, conferred by God himself. And so, like, if all mankind is equal and no one ought to harm him in his life and health, or his liberty of possessions, like, you know, what's kind of happening concurrent to this? Like, you know, like if we're forming this as like foundational to our understanding of what it means to be human, while simultaneously we've got people who look like me who are actually being owned by other people, it's kind of a discrepancy there. So like, Black people are not being recognized as fully human when we're forming this political identity. Like, you know, like that's placing us somewhere on the spectrum closer to possessions, where like other animals actually somewhat reside. And so like, this is what we mean by like actually crafting political identities. And so like, you know, and he wasn't the only one that was thinking this. There are other people. You've got Descartes, like, you know, love talking about Descartes. He comes up often in a lot of the animal rights literature that I read from other people, people like Kim Stallwood or like Alex Lockwood, who have been like thinking and writing about this in philosophical and academic terms for ages. Descartes maintained that animals can't reason and do not feel pain. Animals are living organic creatures, but they're automata, like mechanical robots. Descartes held that only humans are conscious, have minds and souls, can learn and have language, and therefore only humans are deserving of compassion. And what he's talking about here is actually, there's a word for it, it's polygenesis, or like, you know, part of what he's talking about. Polygenesis is a theory of human origins, which posits the view that the human races are of different origins. This view is opposite to the idea of monogenism, which posits a single origin of humanity. So like, you know, the human, there's some sort of recognition that like, you know, that there are categories of humans, but the different races are actually different species. Oh, this is how we get to like rationalize that Black people are a part of the animal kingdom. Polygenesis amounted to a justification for Europeans believing themselves essentially different from the rest of the species. So like, you know, we're a certain type of human. Like, you know, these other animals and like bonobos and like great apes out there, that's like something else altogether. It gives us a justification for owning them. Again, getting back to that capitalism, and specifically that white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, and like, you know, that's going to be a thing that we'll talk about time and time again. There were other people who talked about this. You've got Voltaire, George Forster, Christoph Meiners, Anders Retzius, like loads and loads of people working within like scientific, medical, academic, philosophical spheres who all are like sort of fomenting these sorts of identities. And so you see it over and over again. And we can see how it's progressed all the way through today, and how we're not free of like, you know, the relationship between race and species, because we still see it being used as a justification. San Francisco cops said in this like screenshot from an article, it was legal to murder a Black man because he was an animal. So like, that's one of the things that has like, you know, that still like plagues us even to this day. We haven't gotten away from it, and we will continue to like not get away from it as long as we continue to like, you know, sort of separate humans from the rest of the natural world and like pretend that human is a separate entity that is superior to everyone else who is a part of the animal kingdom. I've talked to people as recently as like last year who said that like humans are not animals. And I was like, okay, yeah, right. Somebody didn't pass 7th grade biology, but I digress. Back to the past. Like, you know, I told you that we would talk a little bit about the agricultural revolution. Robert Bakewell, he is a British agriculturalist who revolutionized sheep and cattle breeding in England by methodical selection, inbreeding, and culling. Bakewell made his farm famous as a model of scientific management, and most importantly, many of his methods are still commonly practiced today. Why is this relevant? This is important because a lot of people in the animal rights community, they are very fond of saying, oh, you're just blaming white people. Why do you blame white people? Why do you hate white people so much? And like, you know, everything isn't about Europeans, Sebastian. And unfortunately, it kind of is. In the world that we're living in, like, you know, like people will say, oh, well, somebody else could have invented, like, you know, like the agriculture or the agricultural revolution could have happened anywhere. Yeah, it could have. It didn't. That's a counterfactual. Like it was created in like, you know, in England in the 1700s. That's a thing that happened. That's a part of our history. And like, you know, and the Industrial Revolution is also a part of our history. Like it or not, like, you know, the globalization of animal agriculture is a product of like European colonialism. That's the reality that we're living in, not the alternate reality where something could have, would have, should have happened and didn't. Like that's the reality that we've got. And so like, as such, like, you know, like we have to recognize our past. And we have to like place this in context of what actually happened, and like, you know, and not necessarily pointing blame, but recognizing where responsibility lies. And this is where Decolonial Spook's Twitter, like, you know, Twitter post or Twitter thread is actually quite accurate. Like, you know what, this is a product of those things. So like going on off of that, like, you know, I just wanted to like identify a couple of other like ways in which whiteness has like, you know, sort of influenced our relationships with other animals or like European thought. And unexpected ways at that. Ensuring privacy. This is a clip from the LA Times, by the way. Benjamin Rees wrote this article in 2017, Why Do We Make Children Sleep Alone? And this was a very interesting quote. Ensuring privacy at night was not just a health concern, it was also a matter of defining proper whiteness or Europeanness. While reformers endorsed solitary sleep as healthful and moral, they noted that savages slept collectively, and this practice was somehow to blame for underdevelopment of the non-Western world. Wow. Now let's see what this has to do with animals. And the rest of the quote, according to the physician William Whitty Hall, author of a popular 19th century sleep hygiene book, individuals in co-sleeping societies were like, and I quote, wolves, hogs, and vermin who huddle together, whereas in the civilized West, each child, as it grows up, has a separate apartment. Where social sleeping persisted among white people, it was usually associated with poverty and considered a social ill. How interesting is that? There's so much in this very short quote. There's so much to be identified here. Like, again, like, you know, the title of this talk is Race, Class, and Species, because like, you know, we can't divorce a class analysis from like, you know, our relationship with other animals or like, you know, our need for animal liberation. Where social sleeping persisted among white people, it was associated with poverty and it was considered a social ill. And like people who did sleep together with their children, like, which is, it feels like the most natural, like normal thing in the world, were compared to wolves, hogs, and vermin who huddled together. And you were civilized if your children were actually separated from you, and in many ways, or many instances, traumatized by forcing children to sleep separate from their parents. Whereas in many non-Western cultures, like, you know, that was not the norm. And let's just go back to that last slide. Like, you know, it was not only healthful, it was a moral good. And people who didn't do this were savages. And that practice was somehow to blame for underdevelopment of the non-Western world. Those people who sleep with their children are animalized and compared not just with any animals, like wolves, hogs, and vermin explicitly. And so, like, these are the ways in which, like, you know, whiteness and white thought, white Western thought permeated and cemented our relationships with other animals by placing them in opposition to us in very meaningful ways as humans. And, like, you know, and creating these social locations based on your race and your social class about who was actually civilized. And, like, Sigmund Freud talks a lot about, like, you know, civilization and the war it plays in our minds with the natural world. But we won't get into all of that because we've only got 90 minutes and I only want to talk for 55 of them. So we're going to move on. There was another, oh, wow, did I actually put that there? Like, I'm terrible about, like, putting, like, I have, like, a blue streak on my slide there. Does anybody want to guess, like, what the main religions are in Japan? Because I just wanted to touch very briefly on, like, the influence outside of Europe as well, because I didn't just want to stick to Shintoism as one. Sina got that correct. Like, you know, I wanted to touch on Japan, or how, like, you know, like, white Western and European, like, thought has influenced our relationship with animals, and specifically with eating meat. Suzanne says Shinto, Buddhism, Christianity. Shinto and Buddhism were the main religions in Japan until about the 1860s. And what happened in the 1860s? Europeans showed up. Like, what do we know about, like, Shintoism and Buddhism? They have religious prohibitions against against eating animals in many circumstances, or in certain sects of it. And, like, you know, and it wasn't common for, like, Buddhists or people who practice these religions to, like, you know, to eat meat. But when Europeans actually showed up and like, you know, and we associated, we, as if I'm Japanese, like, you know, but, like, the Japanese associated meat eating with being successful. And wanting to replicate a Western style of living, actually started to incorporate way more meat into their diets. And so this is one of the influences in the 1800s. Priya says, similar to many Hindus and Jains. That is absolutely correct. And there's a book, actually, that I wanted to, like, reference here. Again, I'm going to throw a lot of books at you. Like, this one is by Marta Zaraska. She also recently wrote for Vox's Future Perfect an article talking about, like, you know, the cultural prevalence of, like, meat, when France had actually introduced in their schools, like, you know, like, a meatless menu for students. There was a city in France, I think it was Lyon. Boy, oh boy, those people were, like, they were taken to the streets like Black Lives Matter. My goodness gracious, like, they didn't like it. They didn't like it. It shows us how, like, culturally ingrained meat eating is in many European cultures. But Marta Zaraska says in her book, The American Occupation After the Second World War gave another powerful boost to the Japanese hunger for meat. The Japanese observed the war victors stuffing themselves with hamburger steaks and bacon. And so, like, you know, between 1970 and 2005, the total amount of beef consumed within the city of Tokyo alone increased by about 160% and 90% for pork. So, like, we see this, like, progressing, and, like, you know, and the consumption of meat, it's like, oh, everybody eats this. And yeah, like, to a degree, everybody does. But, like, you know, we can't influence or, like, try to understate, like, you know, we can't like, understate the influence of, like, of European culture on the rest of the world, and the influence of styles of eating or relationships with animals. I think I actually have this, like, weird blue streak on the rest of my slides. I apologize. Like, I'm seeing that there, and I don't know how the hell that happened. Yeah, it just keeps on. Okay, so, like, that's a thing. Anyway, like, so yeah, like, I also wanted to touch briefly on animal testing, warning in advance. I think the next slide or two may have a racial slur. I'm not certain because I don't remember what I put on my slides, but the future of the Negro, yes, this is from the book Medical Apartheid. Like, we're getting into the 20th century a little bit now. The future of the Negro lies more in the research laboratory than in the schools. When diseased, he should be registered and forced to take treatment before he offers his diseased mind and body on the altar of academic and professional education. It was cheaper to use niggers than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals, says neurosurgeon Harry Bailey. He said that in the 1960s when he was at Tulane Medical School. A couple of these slides, if you've seen me present before, you'll probably be familiar with them, but just act surprised anyway, because, you know, I just want you to be, oh my God, yes, yeah, Michelle has the proper reaction. Oh yeah, be surprised. Oh my God, this is so disturbing. I don't know if this actually was your first time seeing this or not, but it is disturbing. And sometimes people will say, well, the 1960s was a brilliant years ago, Sebastian, like, you know, let's not live the past. But before we actually talk about the timing, let's just look at the careful use of language here. It was cheaper to use us than cats because we were everywhere and cheap experimental animals. Specifically, we were referenced as animals. And so this is an important distinction that I bring up here, or this is an important point of observation, I should say. The distinction between like Black people and animals, it's not something that like that vegans do, or even white vegans, as people are so fond of pointing out. This divide, or like, you know, or I should rather say, like, you know, this sort of categorizing of animals, of Black people as animals. Like, I see somebody had commented about the blue streak. I'm not quite sure what they were saying because only part of it was actually on my screen. But like, you know, the categorization of us as animals, it's been done by white people. And so people are like, oh, I don't want you to compare us to animals. I don't want to be compared to animals. And it's like, that comparison isn't something that, quote, vegans are doing, whether they're white or not. That comparison was actually created by white people long before we were born. And so, like, you know, the sort of like, you know, binary between like Black liberation and animal liberation, it's ridiculous to me because both animals and Black people were actually objectified by the larger white institutions in which we live, or the structure of the society in which we live. And so, like, blaming animals for this, or like, you know, or blaming vegans for recognizing that this is occurring all the way to the present, that's a misplaced like aggression. Like, locating our frustration and our anger on vegans for this is like, you know, that is born from our inability or our like lack of desire to actually like grapple with the fact that like animality is something that has been given to us, and we're feeding into this narrative. Oh, well, like, you know, we're human, and like, you know, we're feeding into this sort of human exceptionalism myth. Like, you know, that like, you know, to be human is to be special, and like, you know, and like, you know, I don't want to be animalized like that. So that's just the thing that I wanted to point out. But yeah, like, so that was in the 1960s. As late as 1995, however, radiation scientist Clarence Lushbaugh explained that he and his partner, Eugene Sagner, chose slum patients as radiation subjects because these persons don't have any money, and they're Black, and they're poorly washed. And it's really, really interesting. This was 1995. Since the 1960s was a long time ago, well, let's just talk about a time when most of us were probably alive, unless you're one of these babes who was born after 2000. And I have no use for you if that's the case, you young people. But he made this interesting distinction. They don't have any money, and they're Black, and they're poorly washed. He said all three of those. That's incredibly telling. Like, we were radiation subjects. We were like, you know, we were perfect test animals because of our race, because of our social class, or like, you know, like our economic class, and because like we were apparently poorly washed. Like, how like, I don't know what to say to that. And if you think that like these types of things don't exist today, like, you know, I've got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. But yeah, like, that's the reality of what we're looking at. And so like, animal testing is one of those things that I just didn't want to overlook. I also didn't want to overlook zoos. You probably have seen me talk about this before. Like, who recognizes this guy? Like, who knows who this is? If you do, then you're going to get a cookie. I don't see anybody popping up in the chat. Ah, here we go. A couple of people got it correct. I see Laura up here. Javier, early human zoos. There are lots of people. Yes, this is Oda Benga. This was a photograph actually taken in 1906. Oda Benga was actually in the Bronx Zoo. So we're talking about well into the 20th century. Well into the 20th century. Early human zoo? Roy, I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes. Human zoo. This image is actually taken from a human zoo in 1958, if I am correct. 1958, 1959 in Belgium. This is a girl in a human zoo. Look at her surrounded by a bunch of white people. Yeah. So when people talk to me about like going to the zoo, because, and I make these distinctions about like animal testing and vivisection and zoos, because I want to get out of the, like, you know, out of the dialogue that largely occurs around veganism as a diet, and recognize that like this goes so much further. Our objectification of others goes so much further. And so like, I want people to understand that zoos are a relic of colonialism. And that like, you know, that placing anyone into a confine so that they can be objectified by an audience, it is reprehensible to imagine. And if you think that it is appropriate for other animals, I've got bad news for you. Up until about like 70 years ago, we were those animals. And so like, you know, that actually gives a lot of people like reason to pause when they are like, you know, thinking about or trying to conceptualize or rationalize zoos in any capacity. Because, and this is important because this is an aspect of our history that's been erased. And so like, you know, when we erase history, when we don't understand history, like, you know, this, like, you know, like these are the consequences of it. And so this, like, you know, this gives us much more of a better context for understanding, like, you know, why, like, you know, why veganism and why like animal liberation is so important and integral to Black liberation. Because these two things, like historically, can't be divorced because of our animalization and because of our shared objectification. It requires a solidarity with other species in order to be free. And this is why, another reason why I think so many civil rights activists, I think like even Cicely Tyson, at the end of her life, she was no longer vegetarian, but I remember an interview with her where she was talking about like how the assassination of Dr. King had affected her. And she said that she had immediately gone vegetarian. And she's not alone. Like Dick Gregory, like there were so many civil rights activists that had adopted a vegetarian or even a vegan diet, a plant-based diet, because of the horrors of systemic racism that Black people have faced. And we forget that. And we erase that. And so we are just trying to, like, this is why we're revising history is an absolute necessary, because we have to drag that right back out into the forefront. We cannot allow those primary narratives to be buried. So here again, and since we are in the 20th century, like, you know, to just kind of like move through the presentation a little bit, many of you know me as a journalist. And one of the reasons why I got into journalism is because I remember everybody has their famous or like their favorite 10th grade English teacher, but I just remember in school, one of my professors at university had said, and he was like a social researcher himself, that like, you know, writing words confers power. And that really, really stuck with me. Like that was one of those things that I recalled, and like, you know, and that moved me in a way that few other things had done. And it's absolutely true. Whoever holds the pen actually has a tremendous amount of power. I'm going to remind people to please mute themselves if you're entering, because then I lose track of like, I lose track of what I'm saying. I'm easily distracted at this time of night at like almost 1 o'clock in the morning, my time. But yeah, like writing words confers power. And so like these historical narratives, being able to preserve them is important. Journalism, like it's famously said, is like writing the first draft of history. And like, you know, I want to be one of those people who actually writes the first draft or helps to craft that narrative as it's going down on paper, because that's another aspect of things that are historically white. But I also beat the drum, as many of you already know, of media in general and media literacy, especially within pop culture. And like, you know, why is it so important to study media? Because media is constantly studying us. There's always somebody who wants to sell you something in this capitalist economy. And like, you know, there's always a desire to like, you know, study human behavior and find out more about us. And what astounds me about people within the animal rights community, if you identify as a single issue vegan or a single issue animal liberationist, you know, to the exclusion of humans, I don't care about anything, just humans, like animals first or animals only, humans second. That's fine, but I think that it is an incomplete analysis, or like, you know, it is a missed opportunity, because like, you know, in order to liberate animals, we have to better understand not just one another, but we have to better understand the like institutional powers that like, you know, are at play, trying to keep us at war with other animals. And like a failure to do that, or a lack of desire to do that, is a severe limitation for us. And so like misanthropy ain't intersectional, says Richard. I know that's right. But like, you know, like with that introduction to media in general, I want to introduce you to someone. Does anybody recognize this guy? If you've seen my presentations before, you may already do so, but you're not allowed to participate. Edward Bernays. Laura, I don't know you saw that before, but like this is definitely Edward Bernays. You know who it's not? Hitler. And I have to put that in the presentation because like I remember this is always going to be one of my favorite memories. I asked that question in a classroom one time, and a girl put her hand up and she said, "Is it Hitler?" And I said, "No, it is not Hitler." But I definitely want to make sure that no one ever says that again. So this is not Hitler. This is Edward Bernays. If you know anything about the history of propaganda, if you know anything about the history of advertising and public relations, Edward Bernays is the great granddaddy of all of that. But he's also the nephew of Sigmund Freud. But like the reason why he is important, and like, you know, the reason why recognizing that he is the father of propaganda, which he later renamed public relations because propaganda sounded too negative, which was itself an act of propaganda. Like, you know, that's actually quite telling, because like he's had a tremendous influence on the food that we eat. Like our obsession with bacon in like, you know, in American society, it's not accidental, it's actually crafted. One of the things that Edward Bernays had done in the 1920s was he revolutionized the American breakfast and made bacon a mainstay because the Beechnut Packing Company actually wanted him to help them sell more bacon. And he did. He wrote to like over, I think, 2,000, 3,000 doctors and asked them if they could like conduct a study saying that like a heavier breakfast was better for the American diet. And they did, namely a breakfast of bacon and eggs. And the rest is history. Like we see these like infusions of bacon culture throughout the United States or US history, like at various times. And it's almost become synonymous with American identity. And in many ways with white supremacy and like people who identify with white nationalism. Why do I say that? Because like, you know, people who identify with white nationalism will very quickly hearken on bacon as like a food choice, which is representative not just of the objectification of other animals, but also, again, religion as well, and the objectification of other humans, human persons, namely Jewish people and Muslims who have religious prohibitions against the consumption of bacon. And so like, this is a symbolic food in many ways. And like, you know, and so like, it's not just a product of our broken relationship with pigs, it's also a product of white supremacy and white nationalism as well, because of the way that it is used. And like, oh, lo and behold, this is a quote from AmericanTable.org. Believe it or not, bacon's association with the American breakfast is barely a century old. Oh, I see Natalie actually talking about milk as well. Oh boy, that's gonna come up. Before this, the majority of Americans ate more modest, often meatless breakfasts that might include fruit, a grain porridge, oat, wheat or cornmeals, or a roll, and usually a cup of coffee. Again, not just a meatless breakfast, but like a pretty vegan sounding breakfast. How remarkable that that's changed and that we've forgotten that, and how disappointing, and the role that Bernays has played in that. And not just like Bernays, but like, you know, the media industries at large. And like, you know, and like, we're not just eating food. I think Carol Adams had actually talked about this when she had written her book, Burger. I don't remember which one of her books that I was reading this in, but Carol Adams talks about like, you know, these, like we're eating culture. These are cultural products. And like, you know, the iconography that is built up around certain foods is part of who we are and the story that we tell about ourselves. And the reason why I have KFC up here is because, again, like because of like, you know, like because of our relationship with media and our relationship with culture. Like this is like, you know, a pop culture icon of America that has been exported to the rest of the world. And we don't actually interrogate the fact that like, we're actually like as a symbol itself, like, you know, Colonel Sanders is a man who's wearing the costume of a 19th century plantation owner. And we all just collectively decided that that's okay. Like, you know, that's just a thing that we do. And that's just the food that we eat. And like, you know, and we're just ordering our buckets of dismembered chickens that have been battered and fried and served to us in, of all things, a bucket. And, you know, and then we get labeled like savages. And I'm like, I can't think of anything more savage than that. And yeah, like since someone had brought up milk, this actually had appeared in a presentation that I had done earlier this week. Milk is a new creamy symbol of white racial purity in Donald Trump's America. One thing that this article from Mike.com didn't get right in 2017 is that, like, you know, it's actually been a symbol of white racial purity long before Donald Trump. Blaming this on Donald Trump is actually, like, you know, it's actually, in my opinion, it's an act of white supremacy itself, because milk has actually been used by people as like a racial identifier or a means to assert genetic superiority for ages. Like the fact that it's actually a part of our dietary recommendations, even though like a good 70 or more % of the world is lactose intolerant, is a symbol of white supremacy. So yeah, like, you know, we can't overlook that, or we can't forget that when we are like doing our analyses. And this is actually a slide that I have from a presentation that I had done last year entitled White Meat. Like, you know, how animal exploitation is a hallmark of white national identity. I'm gonna mute myself and play this minute and a half of Sarah Palin, actually in 2014, talking about New Year's. Oh yeah, we added Fox News to the presentation. Let's take a look at this so that we understand why we did it. One moment while I mute myself and start the YouTube.
Hey, joining us now is Fox News contributor and former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin, live in Wasilla. How you doing, Governor? And Happy New Year.
I'm doing great. Thank you. Happy. You guys look like you're having a blast. Heck yeah, I take them real seriously, and I have 3 this year. First one is eat more meat. Don't worry, they get deeper as I go, the next resolutions. I am going to try to help America, all of us as individuals, make our federal government as irrelevant in our lives as possible. And then the third resolution is to take former UCLA coach John Wooden's pyramid of success and live it out, because it's imperative, you guys, that we as individuals do all that we can to live with industriousness and self-discipline and selflessness, so that together as a whole our nation can be restored to her exceptionalism.
Well stated.
I might need to manually unmute you because I made it so people can unmute themselves. So, oh, and that's my cat. Sorry, just a second.
Oh, thank you so much for bringing me back. I didn't know that if I muted myself, then I all was lost, and I needed you to do that for me. Thank you. So yeah, so Sarah Palin, there you have it. She had 3 New Year's resolutions. Let's put them up on the screen. Number 1, eat more meat. And like, why did she say that? Like, what was the purpose of that? She wasn't surrounded by like rabid vegetarians or anything. There were no soy boys. There was no, like, you know, there was no reason for her to actually have that as a New Year's resolution. The second one, make the American government as irrelevant to our lives as possible. And the third one, follow the pyramid of success so that our nation can be restored to its exceptionalism. And this is an example of what we call dog whistle politics. Like, you know, like she's coding meat with American exceptionalism and making that an integral part of American identity. And so like, and there's like a lack of recognition around that. And so when people like, you know, are so antagonistic toward vegans or people who like, you know, believe in and work toward animal liberation, they're actually missing this, like this coded language. They're actually missing this, like, you know, this sort of like low key, like wink and a nudge toward other people. And like, you know, that are like themselves. Like, so when she starts off by saying eat more meat, that's actually a call to other people who identify with white nationalism in this respect. And so like that's a very dangerous thing that's happening. And we just kind of erase it because of our like almost hostility and antagonism toward animal liberation, or even the very idea of animal liberation. And every time we do that, we actually, unfortunately, create more like, solidarity among white nationalists. And so like, yeah, better than the left does. Thank you, Laura. It's very true. So like, that's just another example of this. And yeah, and the links to like, patriarchy as well, as someone else is pointing out.
Hey, joining us now is Fox's contributor and former.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to restart the video, but yeah, like, and as people like Palin say these things, the meat industry, they kind of recognize it in an almost religious call and response, because they respond in kind. This is from Beef Magazine, and this was from, I believe, last year, as a matter of fact. It's a quote that says, "The fight for the center of the dinner plate is on if tofu, beans, and lentils become the #1 recommendation as the plant-based protein substitutes to beef, then we've not only failed our industry, but we failed the children, military, hospital patients, and nursing home residents who will eat, according to the new dietary guidelines for America." First of all, there, like this again, like, there's no threat to this actually happening. It's absurd that anybody would actually like, be fearful of this, but fear mongering is like, one of the hallmarks of white nationalism. And thank you, Michael, for saying that. And Priya, like, well, someone think of the children, because I was going to point that out. These are all dog whistles. This is all coded language, because like, the like extreme right is famous for calling on think of the children as a trope. Invoking the military, because fealty to the military is part of our nationalism and our patriotism. And so like, that's just another familiar trope that we've got in the, like, in the quiver. And the hospital patients, my God, what will happen to the hospital patients? They just like, they stop just short of saying like, the veterans are going to like die in the streets if they're not eating steak. And in another presentation, I actually have a screenshot from the All-American Beef Battalion website, which is an actual website, and you can look it up yourself. I didn't put it in this presentation, but they're not even trying to hide it, because the website actually has a like, an American flag on it as the background, which is remarkable, because like, like just the marriage of the consumption of animal products and the objectification of cows in particular. And boy, I could do a whole presentation on that. Is like, that like to nationalism and to American identity, and in particular, a certain type of American, that's like, that's a real thing. And our lack of recognition about how that is affecting us. And I do this presentation in different ways and include different slides for different audiences. I'm assuming most of the people here are American, which is why I'm hyper focused on American politics. But yeah, like that's the thing that happens. And we definitely need to recognize that and incorporate it into our analysis. And like, I just wanted to very briefly talk about the, like, what are the consequences if we fail to incorporate a racial analysis? And we're gonna like wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. What you're looking at is an image from a protest in New York City. There was legislation introduced into New York to ban the sale of new fur in 2019, I believe. And the fur lobby didn't like it. And so what did they do? I'll tell you what they did. They actually had gone to the Black church. And so when we fail to incorporate a racial analysis into our work, this is what happens. We leave those people vulnerable to the other side actually doing it for us, and scooping those people up who should have, by all right, been the low-hanging fruit, our natural allies. The Black church is absolutely like, like that's the seat of civil rights. That's the seat of social justice in the Black community. And so the fur lobby went to the Black church and they said, hey, guess what? Like, what, these quote white vegans want to take away your right to wear fur. And we think that that's racist. And so in an act of almost blackface, you have these white fur lobbyists actually encouraging Black people to do their dirty work for them, because if it's anything that legislators don't want to do, it's to appear racist. And so the appearance of racism in this legislation would obviously discourage people from voting in favor of it, even though banning the sale of new fur is like, a net good for the city. But the fur lobby recognized that this was a real danger because, like, of course, New York being one of the powerhouses of the fashion industry, they couldn't have that happen. And yeah, so we're very single issue in the animal rights community. Like F other people, like, you know what, F humans, I only want to focus on the animals. Well, this is the consequences of that. This is what happens. There's a name for it. It's called astroturfing. The practice of masking the sponsors of a message or organization to make it appear as though it originates from and is supported by grassroots participants, in this case, the Black church. It's a practice intended to give the statements or organizations credibility by withholding information about the source's financial connection. And so that's a thing that actually happened. This is a real world example of the consequences of what happens when we, like, you know, just kind of leave a racial analysis out of our animal liberation politics. And when we say that we're animals only or animals first, how are you centering animals by allowing, so that, like, in my estimation, I think that the fur lobby, like, kicked our asses and took our fucking lunch money. Like, that's what occurred here. And, like, you know, but as long as we can say, like, you know, very, like, condescendingly that, like, we're animals first, or we only care about animals, like, you know, we don't recognize that that was a loss. These are just like tweets from Dr. Johnny Green when he was actually, like, encouraging people to come and protest. Like, there's a $250 drawing for an American Express gift card. What the hell? What is that about? And look, these are the images. And I got to thank, I believe, Joshua Katcher for providing these. Like, you know, these are images from the actual protest. Photographer had taken these. And these are actual white people passing out, I assume, like, you know, who are working for the lobby, passing out homemade signs to the protesters. And I have to also be mad at the participants because they ate it up. It's like, what the hell? You don't even recognize that you're being exploited by these awful, reprehensible people, literally in broad daylight. Thank you, EA. EA, I did not know you were here. All my favorites are here tonight. I need to get y'all up on the screen. Man, oh man of shadows, I tell you what. So, like, yeah, like, one of the things as I wrap up that I want to recognize is that in many ways, I actually do think that the animal rights community, writ large, the mainstream community, has actually incorporated a racial analysis into our animal liberation. But the analysis that we have collectively made is that our work should almost be directly and unapologetically and intentionally anti-Black. And why do I say that? Exhibit A, PETA. PETA to Detroit, go vegan for a month and we'll pay your water bill. Why is this anti-Black? Because if you were following the news at the time, the city of Detroit, many residents actually had a hard time paying their water bill. Detroit, Michigan, by the way, like, not so far from, like, people were, like, having lead in their water, but, like, you know, like, people were facing water shutoffs if they couldn't pay their bill. And, like, you know, that's the reality of the situation. PETA had an excellent opportunity to step in and say, you know what, we'll pay your water bill. They chose extortion. We'll do it, but only if you go vegan for a month. A group of people who have absolutely no idea what vegan is, don't necessarily have the resources to do so, don't really understand how to do so, or are given the tools to do it effectively. This is their solution. That was exploiting Black people and the poverty of, like, poor people for an agenda, like, just for a headline. That's what PETA had done. And it's not the only time. Pamela Anderson visits Maricopa County Jail to promote meat-free program. Of course, if you know anything about Maricopa County, it's where Sheriff Joe Arpaio actually had open air detention centers, which were likened to concentration camps. To the degree, actually, that Arpaio was arrested, tried, and convicted by a federal court, and he was actually pardoned by Donald Trump during his administration. Pamela Anderson, as a representative of PETA, actually went there and congratulated him for providing vegetarian food. And it wasn't because of any humanitarian reasons, or even because, like, vegetarian food was compassionate. He was doing it as a punishment in a similar way to the fact that he was making men in these detention centers actually wear pink undergarments to emasculate and dehumanize them. And PETA actually congratulated him for this. And Pamela Anderson actually went to, like, you know, to like, visit him for this. And guess what? Vegan news organizations were complicit. like, talking about this, holding Pamela Anderson up as a, as a beacon of animal rights and veganism. And and really not recognizing the utter depravity of it, and actually how it undermines animal justice because of the fact that that this was done as an act of punishment for people. So this is actually a hateful message. And PETA actually, they willingly went along with, they didn't just go along with this, they organized it. This was an intentional thing. How can we recognize this as anything other than racist? Here again, PETA to donate $1,000 in vegan ice cream to the police in 2016. PETA was donating $1,000 of vegan ice cream to the cops, to the actual cops, in the midst of Black Lives Matter, in the midst of Black people actively being murdered by an over-militarized police force, extrajudicially killed in the street. Their solution to this was to donate $1,000. And people are so fond of saying, oh, well, it's just to get a headline. Well, let's take that into consideration. Let's think about the fact that if you're trying to get a headline, how come PETA is never donating thousands of dollars of ice cream to Black Lives Matter? How come PETA isn't donating thousands of dollars of vegan food to people in Detroit? And how about PETA is not actually, no, they extort Black people, they punish Black people, and they explicitly they go out of their way to antagonize Black people. So when I say that a racial analysis has been done, and the analysis is that it should be we should be anti-Black in the animal rights movement, this is what I mean by it. And yeah, this one is actually one of my favorites. PETA to deliver vegan snacks to Oregon militia. How many folks are familiar with the Bundy Ranch standoff, which was just a couple of years ago? Again, these are news events, headlines that are very relevant to us right now. If you're not familiar with the Bundy Ranch standoff, this is an article from Vox. And this is talking about the 2014 controversy over Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy explained. How did the government get into an armed standoff with a Nevada rancher in 2014? Bundy grazed his cattle on federal lands without paying the proper fees. And when the government tried to stop him in 2014, he actually took his family and stood against the American government. And PETA actually, let's go back to that slide. PETA wanted to deliver snacks to them. This is a thing that's happened. What did Cliven Bundy say about the Negro in 2014? At a press conference, Bundy held forth on race in America at some length. Let's just read this quote because it's a doozy. I want to tell you one more thing I know about the Negro. Said Mr. Bundy, driving past a public housing project in northern Las Vegas. And in front of that government house, the door was usually open, and the older people and the kids, and there's always at least a half a dozen people sitting on the porch. They didn't have nothing to do. They didn't have nothing for their kids to do. They didn't have nothing for their young girls to do because they were basically on government subsidies. So now what do? They abort their young children. They put their young men in jail because they never learned how to pick cotton. And I've often wondered, are they better off as slaves picking cotton and having a family and doing things? Or are they better off under government subsidy? They didn't get no more freedom. They got less freedom. And that's what Cliven Bundy had to actually say about, quote, the Negro. And so, and these are the people that, you've chosen to ally yourself with. These are the people that, we in the animal, and this is the funny thing. This man is a cattle rancher. You can't really say that, this is for a ha-ha headline, and this is a wink and a nod trying to get some press for animal rights. This man is directly responsible for the exploitation of under animals. I have to almost wonder if PETA is actually, if they're deliberately undermining the message of animal rights for some reasons that I wouldn't even be able to understand. But that's what they're actively doing. Yeah, that it is directly and unapologetically antagonistic. And most recently, I'm just going to pick on PETA just a little bit more before I quit. Last year, this is their Super Bowl ad. They didn't, quote, want you to see, and that was snubbed. It envisions a world where respect is the right of every being and pays homage to Kaepernick and movements rejecting injustice. There was a 30-second spot of various animals taking a knee in this cartoon that they wanted to show during the Super Bowl, and it was rejected. And of course, like, you know, PETA actually said like, oh, like it was rejected. It was too hot for TV. They couldn't handle it. And this was all part of like a stunt, obviously, because I think that we all really knew that it wasn't going to get aired. But this wasn't an homage. This was actually an appropriation. People ask sometimes what's the difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation. This wasn't appreciation for Kaepernick because there was no exchange. This was just an appropriation of, PETA didn't have anything to say about Black people. And when they did have something to say about Black people, it was once again to antagonize or extort us. And so like, you know, the borrowing of the taking a knee after Kaepernick had actually been doing it for years, is just that's a theft. That is an appropriation of the gesture. And then the one time that PETA actually did have something positive to say about Black people was last summer, when literally everyone was almost forced at gunpoint to say something about Black Lives Matter because you had, oh, I don't know, protests happening in all 50 states and had expanded to 18 countries around the world. And so they wrote this one blog post, or like they allowed Zachary Tolliver to write this one blog post saying why animal rights activists must stand up for Black lives, even though they spent the past 30 or more years doing the exact opposite of that. And so you kind of think, oh, well, like, has PETA like turned the page? Have they flipped the script or turned over a new stone and realized the error of their ways? No! You know why? Because this is January. This is just like 3 or 4 months ago. PETA boss defends MLK plans in an email rant to staff. And like, you know, and this again, like is endemic of or indicative of the white savior complex. You've got Ingrid Newkirk in a cage here, like once again, centering herself instead of actually centering the animals. And Andrea points out she actually leaked the, I'm not going to read the article or go into the details about the article. You can actually look it up yourself, but it's absolutely disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And yeah, like it reveals everything that you need to know. But of course, PETA is not alone in this. Like I said, like, you know what, our animal rights organizations writ large are responsible. The vegan media or the vegan news apparatus itself is complicit. And like PETA doesn't do this alone in a bubble. Like, you know, you've got like headlines like this, which were taking up most of like animal rights spaces recently. Also in January. January was obviously a very busy month. Extremist vegan is slammed for comparing farming to the Holocaust and slavery, as Clementine Ford blasts him as an abhorrent racist. So you've got people getting into Twitter beefs with like, you know, with famous feminists and feminist icons like Clementine Ford. So like, and this is really funny because like you hear people defending use of the words Holocaust and use of the word slavery and saying like, why don't I get to say it? And it's like, there's not actually like the battle to actually use quote certain words isn't really being waged. Few people are actually, there are probably a handful of people who are actually waging this battle, but most responsible people are actually saying that like, no, language is a powerful tool and it needs to be wielded responsibly. And to do so clumsily and in an unsophisticated fashion undermines our causes. But because the aggrieved entitlement of often white masculinity is so under threat, we interpret that as like, oh, I don't get to say a word. And I'll demonstrate very shortly why this is important. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the MOVE organization. I've got like 5 more slides. I'm so sorry. If you're making it to the end of this, I applaud you. I'm going to give you a cookie, a virtual cookie. The Philadelphia MOVE organization was a Black liberation group in the 1970s and 1980s. Like, you know, like what happened on May 13th, I believe, of 1985 was an absolute tragedy. The city of Philadelphia had committed literally an act of terror against her own citizens by bombing the MOVE house and killing like 11 humans, including I think 5 children and countless companion animals. But what's important about them as a Black liberation group is the fact that they actively and unapologetically incorporated an animal rights and animal liberation message into their Black liberation. Yeah, like I was saying, like the second paragraph here, they were passionate supporters of animal rights and members adopted vegan diets. Members also adopted the surname Africa. Oftentimes, they would engage in public demonstrations related to issues they deemed important. So this was happening before PETA was thinking about being PETA. You have people actually conducting protests. Janine Africa is quoted as saying in a 2018 article for The Guardian, we demonstrated against puppy mills, zoos, circuses, any form of enslavement of animals. We demonstrated against 3 Mile Island and industrial pollution before any of us were even thinking about climate change. Hello, this was the 1970s. We demonstrated against police brutality. And what are we doing now? Still doing that. And we did so uncompromisingly. And this last part of the quote is what I wanted to focus on, pursuant to the previous slide about like vegan activists being like, you know, using language. Slavery never ended. It was just disguised. So no one actually objects to the use of the word slavery. We object to the irresponsible employment of slavery and the appropriation of like the transatlantic slave trade and the history of it and of chattel slavery being used by single issue people who have a single issue agenda that like, you know, that absolutely wants to like exploit this for trauma porn. So like no one said anything at all when Janine Africa actually used this. No one said no one batted an eyelash. In fact, people actually recognized the need for solidarity as a result of her saying this, as a result of her saying that they protest the puppy mills and zoos. These people were doing this before many of us even sitting here on this Zoom were even born. And so the idea that like, oh, I don't get to say it. Oh, you just don't want us, you just want animals in the background. And like, you know, and like, you know, you don't actually care about animal liberation. You have a human rights or a human first agenda, and you want to take words away from us. No one cared that Janine Africa said this. Why? Because they recognized the authenticity of it. And so there was no outcry, there was no outrage because the authenticity of a Black woman actually articulating this in a way that is meaningful and like inspiring and revolutionary, like that's what is transformative. And that's what I think that a lot of white people are not getting within the movement. And this is another quote from the Guardian article. Then there were the dogs. When the 1978 siege happened, there were 12 adults and 11 children in the Move House in Powelton Village and 48 dogs. This was well before the 1985 Move bombing. Most of the animals were strays taken in by the group as part of its philosophy of caring for the vulnerable. I don't know if the slideshow is actually moving. Okay, there it is. Most of the animals were strays taken in by the group as part of its philosophy of caring for the vulnerable. Black liberation, animal liberation, the two are as one with Move. John Africa was known as the dog man, as he was rarely seen without one. Looking at previous news reports about Move, and again, the shaping of media narratives, the Move organization was absolutely hated by the city of Philadelphia, Black people and white people all together during the time, in the actual time. And like, you know, and such was the media narrative that like, you didn't even realize that this was happening. Like that these conversations were happening, or that this type of real on the ground direct action was happening, caring for vulnerable stray animals who were unhoused. In fact, the media narrative was as such that people were actively saying that the Move members were killing and eating other people's pets. That's what actually, like, you know, like just like, boy, oh boy, like looking at like, you know, historical articles and how narratives are crafted. This is why I say, like, journalism being that first draft of history, like when you don't have like everyone with different perspectives or with more accurate perspectives of different backgrounds holding the pens, villainizing actual people who were liberationists is exactly what happens. And we've seen that with not just animal liberation, we've seen the vilification of Martin Luther King and his subsequent, after his death, his like, you know, his sort of like reimagining, and like Malcolm X as well. But this is where we're going to close out. And like, this is the thing, like going back to that first slide from like Decolonial Spook, like, you know, like he doesn't know this history, does he? He doesn't really recognize the history of Black liberation and animal liberation. And yeah, I am a little sore about that. I am a little sore that like in like, you know, in the grand scope of things, like when we talk about veganism or animal rights for Black people, like we seem to foreground health as a concern and background like empathy and compassion and solidarity with other species who experience institutional harm. And like, you know, because there's this sort of like unspoken assumption within the mainstream community that like Black people just can't get it. I will be damned if I will allow anyone to actually rob us of our collective empathy that we currently have, and like, you know, and to erase our history by like thinking that white people have cornered the market about like over empathy and over compassion, and Black people have to be spoken to about like health. That is absurd. It's patronizing, it's condescending, and I won't allow it. It is about solidarity for me, and Decolonial Spook doesn't get that. And people like him don't seem to get that. And as long as they continue to not get that, and they like, you know, kind of present the Black struggle as independent of the animal struggle, and like center, like, you know, Black men and white women doing a similar thing, like, you know, to the detriment of animal rights, or like to the exclusion of animal rights, you're just propping up the hierarchy. And so like I leave with this quote, as I do so often with my presentations, because I think it's such a powerful quote: solidarity is not a matter of altruism. It comes from the inability to tolerate the affront to our own integrity of passive or active collaboration in the oppression of others. And from the deep recognition that, like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on the planet. Like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being, not human, not person, on the planet. And that is such a powerful quote to me. Patrice Jones talks about this as well. It's like the notion of species solidarity is absolutely like integral to our freedoms and to our liberation. And that's the end of the show. Like, this is the last slide. If you're not already following BGN, please do follow us on social media. These are all of our social channels. I also have a link to my Patreon at the bottom in case anybody wants to donate. And I implore you to pretty please donate. We get very few, like, I gotta tell you, like, one of the worst kept secrets in the world is the fact that, like, when you're deeply critical of a lot of mainstream organizations, it actually silos you off from the availability of money from the people who would fund the mainstream organizations. And so as such, we don't get a lot of opportunities to collect. So if you want to donate to my Patreon so that we can continue creating content and doing talks like this for other organizations for free, or if you want to invite me to do a presentation yourself, like, you know, I am absolutely available for your weddings, funerals, and bar mitzvahs. So like, thank you all for coming out. I'm going to close the share, turn my camera back on, and open it up for questions, comments, concerns, anxieties, apprehensions, and emotional outbursts, if anyone has them. I saw a few of them, and like, now that I'm looking at the chat actively, I see that there are over 100. I missed a lot. So if Jess, you or Gordico want to moderate, like, you know, I will never be able to like swim through these myself on my own.
Yeah, I tried to keep an eye on some, and it's difficult with the chat. So I guess first, before we move on, how much time would you like to spend on Q&A? I know it's late for you, so if we have like a stop time so that you're not like...
Can we do it? Let's give it like 20 minutes. Let's give it 20 minutes. I went longer than I meant to.
Okay, so we're going to do it 20 minutes. Because I had made it so that people could unmute themselves, because I didn't want anything bad to happen. We're going to keep it that way, but what you can do is if you raise your hand, your virtual hand, I'll unmute you. So in the reaction section at the very bottom of your screen, you can click that and click raise hand. If you're on a phone, it's very similar. I think there's still a menu at the bottom that says reactions. You might have to click more to get to it. If you're on like a literal phone, like you're not seeing a screen, I think it's *6 to raise your hand. If someone knows otherwise, you can type it in the chat. And so I will call on you, and then you'll see a little message that says you can unmute. So we will start here. If I can get it right.
Hi.
Yay! Hi!
How's it going, Sebastian?
It's going good. I'm so glad to see you. I'm so happy you're here. I'm a very big fan. EA Loves Life on Instagram. That's her app. So definitely like look for her. I'm going to type it in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love the presentation. I've seen, you know, a lot of those slides before, but a lot were new to me or refreshed my memory. So I greatly appreciate it. And I guess it's not really a question, more of like a comment, but kind of a question. But I don't know if you saw I Heart Erica on Instagram made this really, really long Instagram story dragging veganism. And then at the same time, she kind of uplifted, you know, Black, Indigenous people of color and say that they do veganism differently than the mainstream. But a lot of things that she said were really like overarching broad statements that were completely inaccurate. Like one of the statements she made was that speciesism does not exist. It's not a thing. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, there is this desire in the vegan movement for when you speak up vocally and critically about total liberation, then you kind of become like the spokesperson for it. So you get all the DMs like, did you see so-and-so's post? Like, how can we address this person? And like, for me, like, that's not my job or my role to like address every single like activist that speaks like out against veganism. But I was thinking about like, how do we change this narrative and make, you know, the other side of things more available for anti-racist activists to see that there are ways of, you know, being consistent anti-oppression and being vegan. Like, I hate the fact that white veganism, like you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, is always used as a crutch for people to bash veganism. Like, that's not the only form of veganism that there is. So yeah, that's basically all.
No, that's like, that is a good comment / question. Like for myself, like what's one, like two things that I will say about this. Like number one, I can't remember what his TikTok is. I think it's like Vegan Soy Boy or something like that. But I think Evan Atlas, I think that he did like a really short video on this. And like, and he was just saying that, like, I'm paraphrasing here, but he was like, I just think it's funny that like, we always talk about white vegans did this and white vegans did that. But you know what? You're actually contributing to that narrative because you know, obviously, because you're making the distinction between white vegans and not white vegans, you know there is a difference. You know Black and brown vegans are out there, but you choose to highlight the problematic white vegans, and that's just a cover for your own antagonism and hostility towards animals and animal liberation. Because if you actually cared about like Black vegans or Black people in general, you would probably A, be vegan yourself, or B, at the very least, be talking more about the Black ones instead of the white ones. But you go out of your way to use the white ones or the problematic ones as a foil for your, like, you know, for your bigotry. And that's like, that's the reality of it. That's the tea. That's the tea. But the other thing is, like, you know, how do we counteract that? I definitely don't think that doing it one by one is the, like, you know, is the most effective or efficient way, because like there's a new person every single day, isn't there? For myself, like, I prefer to just do my own work and let that speak for itself, because every single time somebody has said, well, X person said this about, like, you know, about vegans or white vegans or something else, and I'm like, you know what? Boom, I tell you what, like, I actually wrote about that in 2017. Here's the link. You know, like, if you want to fight this, promote my work. Like, you know what? Because I've already done this. I've already addressed it. Do it once and done. Like, I've moved on. I've got better things to talk about. Unless this person is making a new point. And I'll tell you what, they never are. They never are making a new point, because they're all what? Tired and sorry. They are very, very sorry. And so, like, you know, because they don't have nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. And so, like, yeah, like, you know, like, that's my response to it. Like, you know, like, I'm like, I have found my own form of expression. I've put it out there to the world, and this is the thing. This is why I have a Patreon, because I do it for free. I don't want it to be like, you know, like, I don't want it to be like hidden away in a book or like inaccessible to people who don't want to like shop on Amazon or don't have that local bookshop or whatever have you. It's on the internet. And guess what? It is sourced within an inch of its life. All of the social science, all of the best available information that we have at this time indicates that yes, speciesism is a legitimate form of oppression. And yes, like, you know, increasing our empathy towards other animals actually does increase our empathy towards one another's. And it is actually like unscientific, as has been proven, to think that people who have more privilege actually have more compassion, because they do not. It is the people who actually hold the least amount of social and economic capital in this world who have the most compassion and who have the most empathy. And so by perpetuating this narrative, the veganism is for rich white people, it is false. It is built on a lie, not even a like misunderstanding, but an outright lie. And we're pushing it because of our anger and our misplaced or mislocated like just hatred of other animals. So that is a very good comment. I appreciate you saying that. So Jess, who else we got? If there were comments or questions in the chat from earlier while I was still speaking, like, let me know, because I didn't want to wade through that or try to, like, you know, like try to find anybody's like questions in there.
Yeah, there were a lot that I am not going to be able to chase down, but I do know that at some point in your presentation, a few people asked specifically about, I guess, Holocaust and slavery comparisons, which has been a hot topic recently, it seems. So you could address that a little bit before we move on to the other raise hands.
Yeah, I tried to address that a little bit in the presentation. Like Holocaust, I can't really speak about so much because I'm not a Jewish person and I am not a scholar of Jewish history. However, Laura Schleifer is on this presentation. And if Laura is still here and you want to link your Facebook profile so that people can get in touch with you, I would ask you to do that, or I would invite you to do that. Don't feel any pressure to do so because I don't want to make you the spokesperson for all things Jewish. But I do know that as a scholar, you have spoken to this before and you have provided resources before for people to do that. And so in the interest of time efficiency and of passing that microphone, I want people to contact Laura. Joshua Catcher, who is online as, I believe, the Discerning Brute. He is a fashion designer in New York. He actually had made an Instagram post that was reposted by Vegan Voices of Color that also addresses the use of Holocaust language and imagery. And I think that Joshua's is probably the most definitive be-all, end-all post about that. And he posted it quite recently too. I think that it was in January. So you go to his Instagram or you go to the Vegan Voices of Color page, you'll probably be able to find it within the past couple of months. And because it was such a hot topic, at the time because of people. Now, to talk about slavery, as I had said in the presentation, the word slavery is not owned by any one group of people. And people tag me all the time. And it's like, he said slavery and he said slavery, this, that, the third. And it's like, I don't really want to get into a messy discussion about the fact that a white person has said slavery or used the word slavery. We know largely why, white identified people, you do it, and it is in the interest of trauma porn. I can only say this. In my work, I've never in 6 years in any classroom or in any lecture that I have done, had anybody come up to me afterwards and say, oh, you're wrong or you're bad for using the word slavery. But I know those same people would not have reacted the same way if they encountered an activist on the street. What's the difference here? Number one, I give people a context to talk about these things and a reason why these things are are connected with one another and our complex, very deep, centuries long relationship with Blackness and animality and how we have been analyzed under the white gaze. And people have been invited into that conversation because there is a manner of consent in it. You don't just stumble into a classroom without knowing what's on the syllabus. You don't stumble into a lecture without knowing what the talk is about. Largely, you don't anyway. If you do, then I'm very sorry for you. But you have consented to be there. You know what the topic is about. You're not being hit over the head by someone who was deliberately trying to trigger you, versus a guy who's sitting at a table out in the street or someone who has jumped you outside of a Starbucks and says, I'm going to talk to you about animal agriculture and tell you why it's slavery. Somebody, I'm not naming names, going after a celebrity who raises her own chickens on the internet. Yeah, I think that that's wrong. But what have you accomplished by calling her a slave owner? What has that done? Other than make you feel good and make you feel proud of yourself because you've done something. That again is centering yourself. That is indifferent. I did a presentation earlier this week about white savior complex. That is white savior complex. And so that's the reality of it. These are the key differences here. Make people an active stakeholder in the conversation by understanding their social location and where they're coming from. And and helping them, not centering where you want them to be, but rather meeting them where they already are. And you simply can't do that by jumping people and demanding a debate on the street with them so that you can film it and put it on your social media. That's my whole answer.
Laura, you were next anyway, so you can go ahead and jump in.
Oh, okay. So first I'll say, just quickly in response to that, actually, I'm doing a show, the Animal Rights Show that Christopher mentioned earlier, this Monday, and I'm going to be talking about that very subject on it. So if you are around, it's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday. If not, it will be up on YouTube immediately after, but definitely check that out because I will be talking about that subject. And specifically, it's complications with the history of the animal rights movement and a lot of things that people don't know that kind of complicate this issue specifically for our movement in many ways. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. Second thing I'm going to say is, so Christopher, first thing is a comment. As I was listening to you speaking about the Enlightenment, so as you mentioned, I've been doing a lot of research on the Enlightenment as well. And one of the things that was very eye-opening to me was the fact that what started them thinking more about the human-animal divide in the Enlightenment was specifically that they were doing vivisection on animals, and they realized that animals have the same nervous system and have the same and have brains. And that really created kind of like an identity crisis for these Europeans, because of course they believed that they were so different, and then they saw that they were not. And as you were speaking, it just hit me, did they project that identity crisis that they were having onto the people they were colonizing? So it was actually their own insecurity about their own difference that they projected. Because I think they projected a lot of things, but I never really quite thought of it in that way, that they had this cognitive dissonance of that realization and projecting it onto the colonized people instead, so that they could distance themselves from that realization. So that was the first thing, and I just wanted to know what you thought of that. And the second thing was just about the whole issue of health and veganism, because I have heard, you know, a lot of Black liberationists talk about health in terms of it being an empowering thing for Black liberation, to think of veganism in those terms, plant-based foods in those terms, and that can even kind of open their minds to animal liberation after that, because they don't have that defense mechanism up of still being invested in eating animals. And I was thinking, I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether you think that that is something that can be used as a way of reaching animal liberation that is valid. And, you know, kind of the whole concept of, because I've been thinking about total liberation in terms of almost like, it's like an entity that you could have many different portals into. And animal liberation is one portal. Of course, Black liberation would be another. So, but you still could reach that same wide opening of, wow, you know, all this is connected no matter which one you come through. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
First of all, like, I'm just going to acknowledge Natalie, who popped up on the screen, like literally like 2 seconds before you finished. And like she said, health being food justice versus diet culture. Like, yeah, like that's precisely how I would characterize that. So I'm going to go in reverse order for your comments and just like start there. I don't critique anyone's point of entry into like veganism. If health is your point of entry into veganism, that's fantastic. I picked up what I thought was a diet book when I read Skinny Bitch in 2004. Not a very feminist introduction. Hello. So what a surprise. Like, I thought I was reading a diet book. I get to like chapter 3, they take a hard left turn off a bridge and start talking about the horrors of animal agriculture. And the like animal argument, like, you know, and the like ethical argument absolutely sucked me in. So like, you know, in some ways you might be able to say that like I was attracted to veganism because of health. So like, yeah, I don't critique or like, you know, or disregard or discourage anyone's like point of entry. At the same time, like, you know what, I choose not to do that or use that as a point of entry for myself, because like weighing it against the consequences and the limitations of it, I don't see its value. When you allow people to have a conversation about diet, you're opening up the door to accusations of fat phobia, which are well-founded based on like, you know, like the things that people have done in the animal rights movement. Like, you know, the erasure of people with eating disorders, like food access being limitations. And so all of these things I feel like are related issues of food justice that definitely need to be addressed and are adjacent to animal liberation in our struggles for total liberation. But I don't want it to be limited to that in my work, simply because like, I think that like, you know, allowing that is, that's very hard to like, to make a case for veganism as a movement for justice later on. Oh no, your face went away. I hope that you're still with me. But like the reality is that like, is as such that, that I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because like I froze up for a second. But the reality is as such that like, you know, that diet is an incredibly personal and individual thing. Some people will experience like, great health outcomes because of like adopting a plant-based diet, but that is because you're eating a healthy diet in general. It's not being that it's veganness, it's the fact that it is a healthy diet altogether if you're eating a whole foods and plant-based diet. But other people may not experience those health outcomes. And when they don't, it makes it a way easier for people to abandon veganism and animal liberation. So like, and also like, I don't undervalue people's ability to like, to understand these concepts as they're given to us. Like, as has been demonstrated by the MOVE organization, like an ethical imperative absolutely works and people can adopt it. And in fact, more people do adopt it because they recognize that, that we have this sort of like this commonality. And so like, for me, it has been effective and it is effective. And like, and like just convincing people to give a damn about someone other than ourselves is such a powerful act. And it terrifies the state to the degree that they literally burned people alive for it in 1985. As to your other point about projection, this is why I actually do incorporate a psychoanalysis into like, into things that I study. And why I had mentioned Freud earlier, because like psychological projection is absolutely something that happens. And to project like those insecurities onto people who were being colonized, like, and animalizing them in that way is a very, in my opinion, real thing that happened. And so to that end, I completely agree with you and very much looking forward to seeing your thoughts on the Animal Rights Show. I won't be there, because it's like, it's going to be hella late for me. And I got other things going on, but I will watch the instant replay later on. So thank you for asking that question. We've got time for like one more question. So like, Jess, if you've got one more or someone else had something to say.
So we've got two hands up, Victoria and Javier. We'll take them, just, keep them succinct. Yeah. So we'll, let me click the button so you can unmute yourself. Did it work? Okay.
Thanks. May I begin?
Hey, Victoria.
Hey. Yeah, first off, it was a lovely talk. And so this might be a bit of a strange and unusual question, but in particular with regard to the discussion of PETA and Ingrid Newkirk and some of the really atrocious things surrounding that. One thing that maybe like rather weird, but one thing that I was thinking about that it brought up for me was, and I was curious if you were familiar with it, but I was thinking earlier a lot about the warped psychology of Ingrid Newkirk's very bizarre will and the things she wants done with her dead body. And she has it all up for anybody to read on PETA's website. And if you go through it, she literally wants to be made into burgers and cooked. And she wants her skin to be removed and used decoratively. She wants like one of her feet to be made into a lump. I mean, going into the literal Nazi comparisons, and like she wants like one of her eyes to be removed and put on display and things like that. And then there was a part of it where she talked, this was very weird, but she talked about having her heart removed, and apparently she wants it buried on a track where Michael Schumacher won a Formula One race. I don't understand that completely, but anyways, like I was just thinking about that as we were talking about her and just like this, and like I was just curious if you have thoughts about that and like this the obsession of this white female with having her dead body animalized and like treated in this way that is comparable to how the bodies of people of color have been treated and are treated. And I'm just really curious about like just the bizarre mentality that goes into that and like this fetishization and like just what is going on here. And I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't like, oh boy, like, I mean, I have thoughts. It's not something that I would want to do. The only thing that I can say is that like, I don't want to psychoanalyze somebody that I don't know personally. And for the record, I am not a trained psychologist. Like knock wood, we'll have our MA soon. But to actually I don't know why she wants those things, and I can't speak to her thought process. I can't speak to I can only talk about the consequences of the things that she has done and continues to do, and those consequences are incredibly anti-Black. and incredibly racist. And so to like, you know, to that end, like, I don't understand why she does them. And like, you know, I have never had a conversation with her. I would love to. I would love to be alone in a room with her, or perhaps not alone, because then, like, you know, I don't know what anybody will say happened in that room, but I would love to be in a room to have a dialogue with her and find out what's going on in her head. But like, you know, I personally don't care what happens to my body after I'm dead. I don't have any specific wishes. I just hope that it is environmentally friendly. But like, you know, but the fact that she has planned it out to this degree, it is, I think, like that's kind of on brand, isn't it? Because it seems like a stunt in a way that, like, you know, virtually everything that like she has done from the, like, you know, the public relations perspective has been a stunt. And I don't know how she feels like that will further the cause of animal liberation. But if she does feel like it would further the cause of animal liberation, more power to her, as long as it doesn't affect any other Black people. And like, you know, that is what I care about. What is the impact to Black people? What is the impact to animals? And so like, if she wants to like be, I don't know, if she wants to be burned in effigy, or if she wants to be given to a 3-ring circus, like, if you like it, I love it, sis. Bodily autonomy, that's what we're here for. And you have it. And you can have them turn your foot into your face and your face into your butt, whatever it is that you want. You like it, I love it. So that's what I've got to say about that. Thank you for that.
Well, I mean, there is the possibility, which was suggested earlier in the comments, that she is a psyop, I would actually bet that to be the truth with a large percentage of my life savings. But I'm also, like, I'm particularly interested in like the kind of fetishization and appropriation that I see going on there, like where basically it seems that like she has like this document about what specifically she wants done with her body that seems to be just very much like fetishizing like other people's trauma and like things that have actually happened to other people's bodies and bodies of people who don't look like her specifically.
Yeah, like, again, like, I do, like, it does come off looking like a fetishization, but again, bodily autonomy, like, if that's her thing, her body, her wishes, and like, you know, and her eventual passing, which we all hope is a long time off into the future. May you have many years in front of you, Ingrid, many less racist years in front of you. But like, you know, and what she wishes to have done after she's gone is her concern. So I did notice that there was we do have time for Javier's question. I did notice there was like a comment about Seaspiracy also, and I'll address that before we wrap up because I can say that very quickly. But please, yes, Javier.
Hi. Yeah, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment actually. But you kind of brought it up. I feel like it's important to stress that human ontology and like what we define as humanity versus animality, you know, that is very it's not just that it's tied to racism. There was a point in time when the racial conversation and, you know, species classification was the same conversation, and Black bodies, Black people were specifically not seen as human beings as a whole. We are seen as like human, but not really nowadays. But that's more of, you know, a recent phenomenon. Black people, when we first arrived in the West, were very much so classified as a separate species and were treated as such. And I think that it would be a good way to get more Black people on board by stressing, you know, that these categorizations and that this relationship that we have with what we perceive to be other beings, the very perception itself, you know, is a white supremacist fabrication in many ways. But, you know, that's just my thoughts on it.
Woo, she got good thoughts. Go on ahead with your bad self. Like, you're speaking the truth right here. Like, I have nothing to add to that. So that's not a question. That was a necessary part of the conversation. And I apologize. I had to actually stop myself or hold in my laughter while you were speaking, because like I am using my mobile phone for like the camera, and I had a notification come at the top of the screen. Somebody actually did just pay, like donate to my Patreon, $6.66. So somebody's petty with their 666. Whoever it is, I'll find that out and I'll put you on the internet for doing that. I live for your 666 donation, whoever that was. But Javier, thank you for saying that. You are giving us life tonight. And I did say that like somebody had mentioned Seaspiracy, I saw it in the chat and how it was getting pushed back. The talk that I did earlier this week about white savior complex actually started with Seaspiracy, because I did watch the documentary last Thursday and I participated in a Clubhouse chat over the weekend. EA was there, and someone was actually talking about, I don't like that there's all this conversation about white savior complex with Seaspiracy, and what is this white savior complex? And like, you know, if there were people that like in my community who had seen that, it would discourage them from participating in animal liberation. First of all, I'm Black, and I don't give a shit what people say about, like, you know, whatever is going on. Animal liberation is something that I'm doing independently of what people say about me. And believe me, people have a lot to say. Secondly, like if people are like having conversations about like white supremacy and white savior complex, and there is such pushback against it, we should probably try to understand why. And this is another benefit of actually coming at this from a journalistic perspective, because the first thing that I did is I started looking at the search data around the movie over the weekend, which has probably shifted by now, but I took some screenshots for the presentation that I did on Monday, I believe, or Tuesday. But anyway, like, you know, people in primarily Western countries were the consumers of this documentary, and I see Victoria calling it a shockumentary. And like, you know, and there were like, and searches for white savior as a phrase, as a related topic had shot up by 3,400%. And so irrespective of how we feel about these documentaries or like, you know, these movies as cultural products, as wonderful as they may be, as relevant and important and great as they may be, we cannot divorce it from the conversations that actually happen in real time and the conversations that that about how they are received. I personally think that, like, in addition to a couple of inaccuracies, Seaspiracy is the victim of poor timing, because we have this rising tide of anti-Asian sentiment, and you have a white presenting person like Ali, who is the main star and the director of the film, like going around and like, you know, and in many ways, like making Japanese people themselves, like, you know, the primary antagonists, if you will, in the documentary. And of course, like when I had done a related search for white savior, like he was the third result. Cher was the #1 result. If you look up news stories and Cher in the past week, you'll find out why. That was a fun surprise. But yeah, like I think that like it's really important for us to, like, you know, this is why media is important, isn't it? Like this is why understanding digital media is important. This is why understanding news is important. Yeah, Cher, as in the singer, as in the gay icon Cher. Like I said, like Google Cher in recent news stories and white savior, because that was funny as shit. But like, yeah, like I think that, like, you know, part of the pushback is that I personally, yes, I did see some inaccuracies in the documentary, but my bigger concern is the fact that, like, we're doing a lot of battling right now against conspiratorial thinking and the rise of misinformation and fake news in the larger society. And like, you know, conspiracy theories being linked to veganism. I'm actually writing an article about it right now for Euronews. That's a very worrying thing. Again, marrying health to veganism, like veganism and the wellness community have this Venn diagram in which conspiracy theories actually is very much in the middle of it. And so, like, you know, you've got this rise of people who have all of these conspiracy theories. And I don't think that having this family of documentaries that literally includes conspiracy in the title, like Cowspiracy, Seaspiracy, what the health, and some sort of health spiracy, I suppose, might be on the horizon as well. And like maybe the Chickenspiracy and the Pigspiracy. Like, I don't, like, you know, there's this family of documentaries that implies that there's some vast conspiracy that's going on, that like a conspiracy is a secret plot. There's absolutely nothing secretive happening in these industries. We know exactly, they're doing it out in the front garden. Like, you know, this is not a secret. There's no, yes, like Natalie's saying, there's no need for conspiratorial thinking. And yet we kind of nurture and encourage and enable this in our communities. And we already have like a very strong anti-vaccine contingent, some of it grounded in our ethics, some of it grounded in a misunderstanding of science. But like, you know, I think that that is a very real danger. I don't like the idea that we keep making these documentaries and implying that there is a shadowy cabal when there's no fucking cabal. It's just a bunch of rich white men who are making bank off of the exploitation of animals and the complete like bastardization of our planet. And so, yeah, like that's the reality of it. Those are my thoughts on Seaspiracy. I don't really push back against it, but I think that there's room to do better. Like, you know what? I applaud anybody who makes a documentary because that's like really hard work. I haven't seen Gunda yet, so Roy was asking me about that. So like, I can't really speak to that. I'm working my way up to it. I really am. I've just been real busy. So I think that's about all that we have time for. Like, I am probably keeping people from doing other things in addition from not getting any sleep myself. Thank all of you for being here. Again, I thank the organizers for having me. And I really, really thank all of the people who stuck around for like, there's still, my God, there's still over 60 of you here. I can't say enough how much I appreciate you, not just giving me your time tonight, but giving me your extra time. And like, you know what, I really like, you know, I can't say enough about like how much I care about this community and the community of people who actually care and get this in a fundamental way. And so like, you know, keep going out there, spreading the word, doing good work. I really do appreciate all of you. And I still actually like, because of the way that my phone is set up, I still see Javier on my screen. So I'm just looking at you, Javier. Hey, how you doing? So Jess, do you have any parting words before we go?
Thank you so much. And this was recorded. So sometime this weekend when I get around to it, I'll upload it and send it out by email to everyone. So you can go back and reference anything you need to. That's it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to turn off my camera and just kind of go through the comments. Virgo, thank you.
Well, thank you again. It was
night.
lovely. Have a good night.